Le stream est en ligne. Ok. On va commencer par prendre refuge, développer l'esprit d'éveil et faire une louange à Manjushri. Sangye Chodan Soki Chonam La Chanchu Partu Tani Kyapsunchi Tagi Jinsogi Pesanam Ki Chola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shun Sangye Chodan Soki Chonam La Janchu Partu Tani Kyapsunchi Tagi Jinso Kipe Sanam Ki Chola Penchir Sangye Drupai Shun Sangye Chetan Suki Chonam La Janchu Partu Tani Kyapsunchi Dagi Jinso Kipe Sanam Ki Chola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shon Semchem Tamche Dewa Tam Dewe Gyutam Dempar Gyunching Dunyel Tam Dunyel Gyutam Jelwan Gyunching Dunel mepe dewa tampa tam indrel war gyunching nierin chadan tan relwe tanyon chempola nepar gyunching chomden de jampe yon la chatsen long Kangi lodun jimni chindral nitar namda grapselwe Jinye den kun zin shizik shirni ki tukar lek pamzim Kandak sipet sarar maring mentun dunya gizirwe Drotso kun la buchi tarsen yalak druju yandensung Drunta chadron yamon yalong neki chadron trazenshing Maring munsel dungel nyugu Chinye chazerel drinam Tene tachu sachu tarsan yanten luzo Gerse tuenkun Chuta chutran chani kientre Tagle munsen champe la dun Seden kienki kien rap öserki Tagle timung mun parap selne Katam tenche shun lu dog pai Lodge pope ngawa tsel tu Bon après-midi.
Good afternoon, everyone. For those who are here and those online, we will continue our studies of the Abhidharmakosha. And just to get started, let's look at where we are concerning the outline. In the first chapter, which is titled The Meaning of the Domain of the Presentation of the Dhatus. There are two main parts, one really big part and then another smaller part at the end. The very big part that we're currently looking at is the explanation of the text. It begins with a first point, which is the definition of the conditioned, which we covered. There were three subparts. We looked at the supports of the definition of the conditioned, the synonyms for conditioned, and a particular explanation of the synonyms of associated with factors for descent. In the outline, underneath the definition of the conditioned, it says 4 parts, but actually it's 3 parts. In the explanation of the reference text, the main part that we're currently looking at, the second point that we are currently looking at is the definition of the aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. There are 4 parts to this part. First, we will talk about the nature of the aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. That's the part that we're currently looking at, which includes a detailed explanation that we are within. The detailed explanation has 3 subparts. We're currently looking at the first subpart, the explanation of the material aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. This is the first subpart. The material ones come first, then the second subpart concerns sensation, etc., and the third subpart concerns consciousness. Within the first subpart, we looked at the concise presentation and then entered into the detailed explanation. Within the detailed explanation, we saw that there are 5 governing faculties that Sylvain presented yesterday. There are 5 objects, which we started looking at, and then we will also look at non-indicative matter. So yesterday we looked at the 5 governing faculties, and concerning the 5 objects, visible phenomena, sounds, odors, smells, tastes, and tangibles. Yesterday we talked about visible phenomena and sounds. And today we continue with taste, which means that the outline is backwards. It puts smells first. Or maybe it's the explanation that's backwards. Yeah, so the smells and tastes are backwards in the outline that you guys don't yet have in English, so I could potentially fix it for you and that'll take care of it. Anyway, concerning the root text, this is the 3rd line of the 10th stanza, which reads, the first part of the line, taste 6. And now we'll go into this 6. It's fairly simple, fairly succinct. First, Khelzang Puntso explained that the ayatana of tastes is what is experienced by tongue consciousness. The ayatana of tastes is what is experienced by tongue consciousness or gustatory consciousness. Here, the classification presents the fact that we can classify tastes into 6 different tastes. We have sweet taste, sour taste, bitter, like coffee, Khelzang Puntso said, spicy, like chili peppers, savory, and the sixth, which is astringent. Something that makes your tongue feel unpleasant, he said, and that makes it hard to talk. Khelzang Puntso said that in Tibetan medicine there's a plant called Aurora, which is, I don't know, what is it? What is that plant? Well, anyway, that's similar to the taste of an unripe persimmon, I can say. Then comes the presentation of smells. The stanza continues with smells 4. Smell 4. So the ayatana of smells is the domain experienced by olfactory consciousness. And there are 2 times 2 smells. First, there are pleasant smells and unpleasant smells. That's the first classification. Then it was explained that a pleasant smell is something that is good for the nose faculty, and something unpleasant is something that is not good for the nose sensory faculty. And then smells can also be classified into strong smells and mild smells. Or not, or mild and then strong. And strong smells are smells that stand out from other smells. So there's pleasant smells, unpleasant smells, strong smells, and mild smells. And then out of the 5 sense objects, we will look at, and this one has lots of possible translations, tangibilities, tactile objects, tangibles. The stanza in any case reads, and tangibility 11. So there's a little bit more here in terms of explanations. First, we can see that the ayatana of tangibilities is what is experienced by tactile consciousness. These can be classified into 11 types. There are 2 groups. There are 4 causal tangibilities. And 7 derived tangibilities. 4 causal tangibilities and 7 derived tangibilities. So concerning these 4 causal tangibilities, this concerns the elements earth, water, fire, and wind. And here Khelzang Puntso gave some explanations about these elements. They'll come back at another point, but we'll follow the order in which things were given. So concerning these 4 base tangibilities, first, there's something to be aware of, that there is frequently a misunderstanding about these. In general, When we designate something as being earth, we think of something visible when we think of earth, apprehended by visual consciousness by way of eye faculty. But in the context of this text, as we'll see, what we call earth here is really part of the realm, the domain of tangibilities, not the visible. So it is apprehended by tactile consciousness rather than visual consciousness. So, to give some more details, the element earth is solidity, firmness. Earth element is solidity, its function is supporting. In other words, if earth element is not present, the structure of matter would collapse. And once again, this solidity, this characteristic of firmness, is not in terms of the visible. It is something that is apprehended by tactile consciousness. Only body faculty can know this earth element. Only tactile consciousness can know the solidity of matter. Concerning the element of water, it is said that water element is liquidity. Element of water is liquidity. We also use the terms fluidity or humidity. Liquidity is the current term. Once again, it's important to emphasize that this cannot be apprehended by visual consciousness. Khelzang Puntso gives an example here. If we want to know if water is hot or if water is cold, we can't know this with visual consciousness. We know this with the body faculty, or rather, tactile consciousness by way of the body faculty knows this. Concerning the element of fire, it is heat, what burns, what consumes. Concerning the element of wind, it is lightness and movement. Apparently, the Tibetan term for lightness has the same root as a verb that is used to designate being constantly. Clouds are wind. Are clouds the element wind because they're also light, they are also in movement? Well, no. Do not get confused. The cloud itself is not wind because it is in movement due to the wind. It doesn't move due to itself. Whereas the property of being light and in movement in terms of wind is due to itself without depending on anything else. Another coarse example that we can consider is a piece of paper. A piece of paper can float, move, but it doesn't do this due to itself. It does this if there's wind present. Otherwise, a piece of paper is immobile. So this is the way that we can understand movement here. So that concerns the 4 base tangibilities or causal tangibilities. We saw that the 11 tangibilities are the 4 causal tangibilities and the 7 derived tangibilities. So from the 4 causal tangibilities, there are 7 derived tangibilities that are produced. So based on different combinations of the 4 base tangibilities, we come to these different derived tangibilities. All material elements have these 4 elements as their basis, and by combining them, we come to, or different elements are produced. So out of the 7, the first is softness. Softness is the result of the elements fire and water in large quantities, and the elements earth and wind in small quantities. Fire and water in large quantities, earth and wind in small quantities. This yields the derived tangibility of softness. And the second is the tangibility of roughness. Here, this is produced by an excess of fire and earth. Excess of fire and earth yields rough tangibility. Next, when there is an excess of earth and water, this yields heavy tangibility. When there is an excess of earth and water, this yields heavy tangibility. Next, when there is an excess of fire and wind, an excess of fire and wind elements, this yields tangibility of lightness. Next, if among the 4 elements, water element is predominant and there is little fire, then this yields cold tangibility. And in this list of 7, there are 2 inner tangibilities. The first is hunger, which is produced when there is a lot of wind and very little of the other elements in the stomach. Then we feel this hunger tangibility. And then there is also thirst tangibility, which we feel when there's little water in the body and a lot of fire. And then there is thirst tangibility. And if we drink something, then the element fire is reduced and our thirst is quenched. Thirst tangibility. That's the presentation of the 7 derived tangibilities. And then just to conclude, there is a short remark concerning softness tangibility. We saw that based on the 4 base tangibilities, the derived tangibilities are produced. However, for the tangibility softness, this is not always the case. It's necessary to be conscientious because apparently softness can also be included among the base or causal tangibilities. For example, Sometimes we talk about a soft wind. We can feel the wind by way of our body faculty, and we say, oh, it's a soft wind, a soft breeze, for example. And in this case, the softness is not included in the derived tangibilities, it is included in the causal tangibilities. However, for a piece of fabric, for example, if we feel that fabric is soft, then it is not a causal tangibility. The softness at hand here is a derived tangibility. And so, in order to be precise, Khelzang Puntso shared this particularity concerning the tangibility of softness. This concludes the explanation of the 5 ayatanas of the sense objects, the ayatana of the visible, of sounds, of smells, of tastes, and of tangibilities. And now Sylvain will speak to us about non-indicative matter. So we have seen that there are 11 types of matter. In stanza 9, the 5 sense faculties were explained. These 5 sense faculties are said to be inner matter. And in stanza 10, the 5 sense objects were explained, and these 5 sense objects are said to be outer matter. And so what Alexandra just concluded concludes the presentation of the 5 inner matters and the 5 outer matters. And now we will talk about the 11th matter, the non-indicative matter. We'll talk about it over the course of 2 points. First, we'll look at non-indicative matter in and of itself, and then we'll talk about its cause, which is the elements, which are the elements. In the Vaibhashika tradition, this 11th matter is indeed non-indicative matter. We'll present this non-indicative matter by way of its 4 qualities, which are presented in stanza 11. Which reads, present even when there is deviation or absence of mind, virtuous or non-virtuous, it perpetuates itself. Its cause is the great elements. It is called non-indicative matter. Now we will explain the 4 qualities of non-indicative matter, which are cited in Vasubandhu's text. The first quality is presented in the first line of stanza 11, where it is said that non-indicative matter is present even when there is deviation or absence of mind. Deviation is a synonym for distraction here. And absence of mind is an alternative translation for absence of consciousness. What does this mean? That it is present even when there is deviation or absence of mind. This means that whether mind is distracted or not, whether it is present or not, non-indicative matter is always present. It does not follow mind. That might seem a bit strange, but we'll have the opportunity to understand this a bit better, what's said here, a little later on. Whether mind is distracted, whether mind is absent, non-indicative matter remains present because it does not follow mind. That's the first quality. The two following qualities are stated in the second line of stanza 11. The second quality then it is said that it is virtuous or non-virtuous. This means that non-indicative matter is defined or determined. It is either virtuous or non-virtuous. It cannot be neither of these two. This is its second quality. Next, the third quality. Non-indicative matter is continuity, meaning that it has a series that perpetuates itself over time. And here Khelzang Puntso said this is contrary or in contrast with sound, which has no continuity. This non-indicative matter perpetuates itself in a continuity over time. The fourth and final quality of this non-indicative matter is that it is formed based on the four great elements that Alexandra just spoke about in the aspect of the tangibilities. This concerns the elements earth, water, fire, and wind. Dhatus, earth, water, fire, and wind. Here, Khelzang Puntso went into a bit more detail. This non-indicative matter is formed based on the four great elements. In other words, the fourfold causal matter. This is the same fourfold causal matter that we find in the presentation of the aggregate of matter. Nevertheless, this non-indicative matter is not formed based on the fourfold causal matter that is external or outer. Non-indicative matter is formed based on inner fourfold causal matter. In other words, the four inner dhatus, or four inner elements. What this means is that this concerns the four elements that the elements that the non-indicative matter relies on are part of the continuity of an individual or a being. In other words, this concerns the elements found within the individual's body. This non-indicative matter is formed based on the 4 elements that are part of the personal continuity of a being. So, the fact that non-indicative matter is present even when we are distracted or without consciousness, that it continues, that it is continuity, and that this continuity is either virtuous or non-virtuous, and that it is formed based on the 4 great elements. These make up the 4 qualities of non-indicative matter. Khelzang Puntso did tell us a bit more about non-indicative matter at this point in time. So here are some additional elements to help understand what it concerns. Nevertheless, it's helpful to know that this non-indicative matter is an important theme that we find presented in chapter 4 on acts, karma, and is explained extensively there. Nevertheless, in order to allow us to know a little bit more about what this non-indicative matter is, it is discipline, the disciplines. When we talk about the disciplines, there are 3 types of disciplines. Discipline of individual liberation. This corresponds to vows of individual liberation. There is discipline arising from meditative absorption, and discipline dissociated from factors for descent. So these are the 3 types of disciplines. And here, Khelzang Puntso continued a bit more by telling us that among these 3 disciplines, some do not possess the 4 qualities of non-indicative matter that we just went over. Discipline of individual liberation possesses the 4 qualities that we just went over. It doesn't follow mind. It does not follow mind. In other words, whether mind is distracted or absent, it's still present. It is virtuous or non-virtuous. It perpetuates itself, and its cause is the great elements. So that was a repetition of the 4 qualities of non-indicative matter. And discipline of individual liberation possesses these 4 qualities of non-indicative matter. However, the 2 other types of discipline, discipline arising from meditative absorption and discipline dissociated from factors for descent, only possess the last 3 qualities of non-indicative matter. Why is this the case? Because these 2 types of discipline follow mind. As they follow mind, they do not have the first quality of non-indicative matter, which is that it does not follow mind. How do these 2 disciplines follow mind? Well, discipline arising from meditative absorption follows mind that is in meditative absorption. And discipline dissociated from factors for descent follows the truth of the path. The latter follows mind that is dissociated from factors for descent. As these two disciplines follow mind, then the non-indicative matter that constitutes them only possesses 3 of the qualities of non-indicative matter. And they are not mind, they follow mind. And Khelzang Puntso went a bit further concerning these disciplines. He explained that a discipline is an act. And the disciplines are acts of body and speech. They are not acts of mind. We'll talk about this a lot more in chapter 4. He added that acts of body and speech can be of 2 types. There are acts of body and speech that are indicative and acts of body and speech that are non-indicative. And then he gave examples. Concerning indicative acts of body and speech, this can be the act of prostrating, the act of making offerings, showing respect for a High Lama, for example. These are acts of body and speech that are indicative, that are perceptible by visual consciousness. Because they can be perceived by visual consciousness. We can see if someone prostrates and expresses respectful words towards their Lama. This act is indicative because it can be perceived by someone else's visual consciousness. Then Khelzang Puntso told us that concerning non-indicative acts of body and speech, they're not visible. Despite the fact that they are not visible, they nevertheless concern acts of body and speech. And we'll see in chapter 4 that disciplines are non-indicative actions of body and speech. They are not perceived by visual consciousness, but they are nevertheless acts of body and speech and not acts of mind. So this concerns the point on non-indicative matter in and of itself. We'll continue with the next point. Let's take a short break first. In the following point, we will see, in fact, we'll come back to the 4 elements that we looked at in the part on tangibilities. But here they are presented as being the cause. In the outline, the title of this part is Explanation of its Cause, which is the great elements. Here we're talking about the cause of non-indicative matter. And so this is where Vasubandhu went into more detail of the 4 great elements. There are 4 subparts to this section. We had a little discussion about its cause, in fact, because these elements are the cause of matter in general, but they're also the cause of non-indicative matter. And this is the point where they are presented in the text. We saw that the aggregate of matter is presented in terms of 5 types of inner matter, the sense faculties, 5 types of outer matter, which are the sense objects, and non-indicative matter. Khelzang Puntso explained to us that these 11 matters, 5 plus 5 plus 1, these 11 matters of the aggregate of matter are known as derived or resultant matter because they are derived from or result from causal matter, which is the 4 elements. These elements are presented by way of classification, the presentation of their function, their definition, and clarification of possible doubts. The classification, the first subpart, refers to stanza 12, lines 1 and 2, which reads, the elements, the dhatus, earth, water, fire, and wind. Another translation for elements that is the one used in terms of the entry to the state of a pandita is the great principle-based appearances. Here in this context, for the moment, we are using this term elements. As we saw, all of the aggregate of matter is based on this causal matter, the dhatus, earth, water, fire, and wind. The following explanations talk a little bit about the etymology. We'll try not to overdo it with the Tibetan terms, but it's useful to look at the terms. Element here translates the term Jungwa Chenpo. Jungwa refers to something that appears, that is a source. Jungwa. This word is used because the 11 matters rely on these elements that are the source of all matter. And so they are called sources. Source. Khelzang Puntso also told us that the 8th Karmapa, Mikyo Dorje, said that these 4 elements are called source because they are the basis or the source of all matter that has existed since beginningless time and all matter that will exist on and on into the future, in the future, continuously in the future. They are its source and they are present in all matter. Regardless of which of the 11 resultant matters we may think of, these 4 dhatus, elements, earth, water, fire, and wind, are what make it up. They are its, what constitute it. So we saw the classification is 4-fold. Now let's talk about their function. This is presented in line 3 of stanza 12, which reads, support, etc. are established as their functions. You'll see that the root text often includes etc. The commentary can be helpful to help us understand what the etc. refers to. Here, soutenir, support, etc. refers to their functions. The function of earth element is apparently it's more correct to say the element dhatu, earth. Its function is supporting. Then there is the function of the element dhatu, water, which is cohesion. Water dhatu keeps things together, it holds them together. Its function is cohesion. Without this element, things would not stay together. They would come apart or collapse. The function of fire element is to prevent things from rotting, to make them grow. Growing here specifically refers to ripening, particularly. Without fire element, wood rots. Without fire element, the fire element is what allows for things not to rot. With fire element, wood remains dry. Then there is the function of wind element. Khelzang Puntso told us this is what allows for movement. And movement in terms of growth, he gives the example of a body growing. What allows for the body to grow is wind element in the body when a baby is developing, for example. This concerns the functions of each of the elements, dhatus, earth, water, fire, wind. Then comes the definition, stanza 12, line 4, which reads, solidity, liquidity, heat, and mobility. So this somewhat similar to what we saw concerning the tangibilities. The definition of earth element is solidity. The definition of water element is liquidity. The definition of fire element is heat. And the definition of wind element is movement. then the next part of this explanation is clarification of doubts, which is explained in stanza 13. We already mentioned this previously, but there's more detail here. Stanza 13 reads, "In the designations of the world, a form and a color are called earth. The same for fire and water. The mass of wind is the Dhatu wind. The mass of wind is the Dhatu wind itself, and also similar to what precedes." This stanza will present how the four elements are perceived generally in the world and how they are presented in the treatise of the Abhidharmakosha. And we will see the difference between these two approaches. In the world, in general, when we talk about earth, we connect with the color and shape. When we think earth, we think of color and shape. I can say the earth in Dhagpo's parking lot is white, and then there's some red earth up on the slope. And this is how we think about it in the world. We use the term earth to designate something that relates to a shape and a color, and therefore belongs to the ayatana of the visible. And as the stanza says, the same is true for fire and water. We say, oh, look, there's fire. Fire is orange, the embers are red. Water will say the water is white, or the river is big. And what is designated in all of these cases in terms of color and shape, this relates to the domain of visual consciousness. In the world concerning wind, there are two ways that we apprehend it. We relate to it in terms of shape and color, as explained before, and we also think of it as a tangibility. Indeed, as in terms of a tangibility, we can say, oh, a soft breeze, soft wind, and this is something that is experienced by tactile consciousness. Or we might say that the wind is cold. We talk about it like that. But we also say that the wind is, when there's wind and and then the leaves start blowing around, you'll say, oh, look, there's the wind is blowing, you can see it spiraling. And in this sense, we relate to it in terms of something that is apprehended by visual consciousness. Another example that Khelzang Puntso gives is more related to practice texts, some of them. We talk about the mandala of wind, and we say that it is shaped like a bow. And once again, this refers to something that is not the domain of tangibility, but the domain of the visible. This is the presentation of how we think about it in the world, and then comes the presentation according to the Abhidharmakosha. What is emphasized here is that beings in the world accept all of these ideas that we've just gone over as fact, but this is a mistake. the way that we relate to it is mistaken. There is a confusion between visible aspects of phenomena, colors and shapes, and the tangibility, the tangible aspect of the elements, which is what they really are. When we designate earth as being a shape and a color, red earth, white earth, in this case we're talking about a color, and we say that this is earth. And the treatise here warns us to beware, because this is not the earth. It is the red color of earth that we see. Likewise, when we see a great ocean, when we talk about a big ocean, we're talking about the shape of the ocean, but we don't see the element water. When we talk about orange fire, the element, dhatu, fire, is not what is perceived. What we see is its color, because the dhatu, fire, belongs to the domain of tactile consciousness. It can only be known by tactile consciousness by way of body faculty. We saw that for wind, and in terms of the example where we talk about wind creating like a spiral, a tiny tornado, we're looking at the visible aspect of a group of particles that's spinning. But what we see is not the wind. It is a visible aspect of something that is spinning due to wind, but it is not the wind itself. Once again, the wind itself belongs to the domain of tactile consciousness and not visual consciousness. Some days, when it's very windy, we see the leaves blowing and we say, oh, look, the wind. But what we see is not the wind, it is the visible aspect of leaves and branches that are moving. And so in the stanzas 12 and 13, what we looked at is the classification of elements, their function, their definitions, and supplementary explanations clarifying doubt about how elements are perceived in the world and how they are understood in terms of this treatise. Sylvain will continue. Let's take a short break. Let's do nothing for a few minutes. Now we come to the following point, which is fairly quick, which concludes the presentation of the material aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. If you look at the outline, point 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, this is the explanation of the material aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. We've looked at the concise presentation and the detailed explanation, and now we are coming to the way of defining the 10 material aggregates as dhatu and ayatana. Well, technically we've covered 11 aggregates, but we're going to talk about the first 10 in this case. This corresponds to what is said in stanza 14, lines 1 and 2. Only these governing faculties and objects are considered to be the 10 ayatanas and the 10 dhatus. These two lines simply explain the fact that the 5 sense faculties, the inner matter, and the 5 sense objects, the outer matters, are the 10 material ayatanas and the 10 material dhatus. And now we can start to see that the presentation of the aggregates ayatanas, and dhatus is really done all at the same time in the Abhidharmakosha. We talked about the 5 aggregates. We'll see as we continue that there are 12 ayatanas and 18 dhatus. In the 5 aggregates, we focus on the aggregate of matter. We saw that this aggregate of matter is made up of 5 faculties, 5 objects, and the 11th matter, non-indicative matter. And now we are focusing more specifically on the 5 faculties and the 5 objects. These 5 faculties and 5 objects, if we look at how they correspond to the 12 ayatanas, out of the 12 ayatanas, we'll find 10 material ayatanas, and these 10 material ayatanas correspond to the 5 faculties and the 5 objects. In the same way, if we look at the correspondence between these 5 faculties and 5 objects with the 18 dhatus, there are 18 dhatus, and out of the 18 dhatus, these 5 faculties and 5 objects will make up 10 material dhatus, the 10 material dhatus out of the 18 dhatus. So that is a kind of aside to begin to introduce this aspect of correspondence between the aggregates, the ayatanas, and the dhatus. We'll talk about this correspondence more extensively. Maybe not this time, but if we don't talk about it this time, next time, for sure. And so with this point, we have concluded the explanations concerning the material aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. If we look at the outline, we'll see that we are in the section called the explanation of the nature of the aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. And within this point, we are within the part called detailed explanation. Within the detailed explanation, we concluded the first point, which is the explanation of the aggregates, dhatus, the material aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. And now we will begin the next point, which is the explanation of the aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas that are sensation, including sensation, then distinction, and conditioning phenomena. That's the etc. In this point, which is the explanation of the aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas that are sensation, etc., there are 4 subparts. First, we will look at sensation, then distinction, then conditioning phenomena, and lastly, there is a point that will present these phenomena and others in terms of the mental object, dhatu, and ayatana. We'll begin with sensation. This corresponds to what is said in stanza 14, line 3, which reads, sensation feels. Then Khelzang Puntso told us sensation is what is felt, what is experienced. Then he told us that in everyday language we talk a lot about well-being, suffering, and sometimes we talk about neutral sensations. We may ask ourselves what brings about these sensations. It is meeting with an object. This occurs based on meeting an object, then we experience sensations. And he told us that when we encounter a pleasant object, we experience a pleasant sensation. When we encounter an is neutral. There is another way of classifying sensations into 5 types of sensations. Here we can take pleasant sensations and divide them into 2. Physical pleasant sensation and mental pleasant sensation. And then, if we look at unpleasant sensation, the same thing is possible. It can be divided into 2. Physical unpleasant sensation and mental unpleasant sensation. That makes 4. And the 5th, which is neutral sensation. And Khelzang Puntso simply told us that this classification is what is understood by the line in the root text. In the English root text, the beginning of the last line is actually in the wrong place, so the part about distinction belongs in the fourth line. This concludes the part about sensations. The following point is distinction. Distinction. Wait a minute. Oh no, it is in the right place. They just cut it up weirdly. Okay, never mind. It's in the right place. Lines 3 and 4, which reads, distinction's nature is grasping as a label. And then he developed on this definition of distinction somewhat. He said, distinction defines as labels. The previous translation, that's a fairly new translation, but the previous translation was that distinction defines characteristics. Yeah, don't that one. Anyway, today the translation has evolved, but the way that it was explained at the time is that this means that the nature or essence of distinction is to characterize, to define characteristics. Distinction will conceive of the characteristics of something without mixing them with the characteristics of another object. It does this by defining things as labels. If we say it another way, by defining or attributing labels to each object. That's the first thing. And then a distinction apprehends the character of each object on its own without depending on anything else. It does this based on its own capacity. So that was the definition of distinction. Then we come to classification. Classification of distinction. With nose faculty. Distinction born from contact with tongue faculty. Distinction born from contact with body faculty, and distinction born from contact with mental faculty. That's the first classification into 6. It's already 4:25. I think we won't have time to present the classification in 2 in the following 5 minutes, so we'll look at that tomorrow. Are there questions concerning what we covered today or the previous days? Concerning distinction, it does this based on its own capacity. This strikes me. It's like that. There's no acquisition. It's just like that. There's nothing learned. There are different elements to answer your question, but we're not really sure about what we might say. We're not sure that it's not gonna lead to mistakes. A bit later on. And just as an addition, we learned that consciousness apprehends the generality on its own, and mental events apprehend the particularities on their own. When this part comes, we'll have more elements of an answer to this question, but I'm not sure that this answers the part about on its own, if that was your question. Well, that remains to be discovered. I have a question. If I understood correctly, it was said, what procures sensation? Meeting with an object that is pleasant or unpleasant. I can understand that objects based on the dhatus can be rough, etc. But the perception that I have of cold can be very different from one person to another. So why do we say that the object is pleasant or unpleasant? That's my question. We asked that question, and Khelzang Puntso talked about it and said, yes, for some people, some objects will be pleasant, and for other people, the same object will be unpleasant. But for the person, when they experience the sensation, the object really exists and the sensation really exists. And so they themselves will classify the object as pleasant or unpleasant, and the sensation. Yes, of course, it's relative, but when we experience it, we really experience it as pleasant or unpleasant. When you talked about non-indicative matter and something about prostrations, I don't understand. Body and speech, but not mind. Prostration is an indicative act of body. That was in the explanation where he was saying that there are acts of body and speech that can be either indicative or non-indicative. And in order to illustrate an indicative act of body or speech. The example was someone who prostrates while reciting the refuge prayer, for example. That is an act of body and speech that is indicative, in the sense that we will see the prostration and we will hear the words that are spoken. Those are indicative acts. And non-indicative acts are a form of matter that is said to be non-indicative. It is not visible. We can't hear it either. Nevertheless, it is indeed acts of body and speech. However, concerning the explanations at this point in the text, there's nothing more. We shared everything we have at this point. Of course, there's more to say because, we received the 4th chapter and there's more about this, but it's coming. There's really information to understand this matter. We'll conclude here today. Sunamdi tamche zekpani tamye